Donna.
And hi, I'm Michael. We are the Fechners.
We're ordinary people. In fact, we're just teachers.
Yes, Donna, we are just teachers, but we have had an incredible journey. One could call it an extraordinary journey. Life has presented us with some unusual opportunities over the past 10 years, and despite the risks involved, we've embraced them all fully, and our glass is now overflowing with possibilities.
We never know
what happens next. Why not take a chance?
I suppose the 10 years all starts with a dream, and we all have that person in our family who has that gift of feeling the future or being visited in the evenings by people from the other side. And this was my niece, Alicia. She came to me when we were at some family get-together, and I always love talking to Alicia because she has such amazing stories. So she came to me one night, and I was happy enough to sit with her. Oh, and by the way, I'm sitting and drinking a glass of Taittinger as we speak, because one of the hints about this whole podcast is the presence of France. Anyway, back to Alicia. She came up to me and she said that she'd had a dream. And this wasn't unusual, so I sat and I was ready to hear the story. She said that this dream was different from the others because it had been recurring for the past week. And she was unsure about what the story was, and she couldn't figure out why she was being presented with it night after night. 2 soldiers had been at the end of her bed, and she was a TL, a teacher librarian, so she could understand the uniforms that the boys were wearing. So she realised they were Australian soldiers from World War I. And she said these 2 boys kept appearing at the end of her bed every night. And she said whilst that might have been just a pleasant little story, she said they started to beckon her and started asking her to join them. So she said, this has been a week. I haven't slept very much. So I'm thinking these boys are related to us. Now, at that stage, I was in my early 50s and I hadn't heard any stories from my family about any connections to World War I. World War II, yes, but no connections to World War I, even though every time I marched in an Anzac Day parade with my students from school, I was so upset that I couldn't wear medals or represent a great-grandfather or a great-uncle in that moment with other Australians. So I said, look, nah, sorry, I know nothing. So she said, please talk to Grandma. So Grandma was my mum. She said, Grandma must know something. So I said, yep, sure, I will. The next day I found my mum and rang her and said, Mum, I have a question. Do we have anybody from our family who fought in World War I? And straight away she said, no, I was born in 1922. The war was over. I was a baby 3 years later. What do I know about World War I? And that in itself said to me that many of the families went on with life after World War I. Some of them were dealing with relatives with major PTSD or suicidal thoughts, and it was difficult to retrace those memories. So many families didn't want to go back into those memories. So I said, okay, all right. She said, tell Alicia there's no one. So I went back to Alicia the next day and she said, they're still appearing. And she said, they're getting louder. And if this continues, I won't be able to work because I have had no sleep. So I went back to Mum again and I said, look, Mum, there has to be somebody. Can you ask your brothers? Her parents had passed, so somebody in your family would know. And then she said, oh, for God's sakes, look, I had an uncle and your dad had an uncle. And there were 3 of them that went over there, but only two were killed there or lost there, and 1 came back. And I said, well, they're the 2, Mum. And she said, well, mine was Cameron Mackenzie, and your dad's was a fellow by the name of Francis Hurahan, James Francis. So maybe maybe they're the guys. So being a teacher, I love a little bit of research, and I straight away got onto the Australian War Memorial website, which is amazing, by the way, and also Archives Australia, and started researching Hurahan and Mackenzie. So all of a sudden, all these details, all these dates, all of these correct bits of information came up on the screen, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I do have two ancestors who fought in World War One, and Alicia's not so half-cocked. I think she's onto something.
So all of a sudden, you had relatives that you could actually relate to.
All of a sudden. So I rang Alicia and I said, yeah, we do. And she said, oh, thank God. She said, I know I'm a bit left of centre, but you know what? These fellas are pretty insistent and they haven't gone away. So the research wasn't difficult. And I would say to anybody who has any soldiers from any of the altercations worldwide, the Australian War Memorial has a fantastic website.
And Donna, they stopped appearing to Alicia then, did they?
No, they didn't. No, they didn't.
Oh.
Our son Ryan happened to be overseas at that time. And he rang and he said, Mum, I'm on the Somme. And I said, oh, Ryan, what are you doing on the Somme? So he and a mate had, as per usual, hired a minivan, a camper van, and were driving around France. And he said, I'm on the Somme. And I said, oh, Ryan, honestly, I've just found out this amazing piece of information. And this was after Anzac Day, it was in May. And I said, you have two great uncles that fought in World War One. One of them is lost, and his name is on the Menin Gate in Ypres in Belgium. But the other one is in a little place in a cemetery called Le Peuplier, in a place called Caste. And he said, Mum, I'm 10 kilometres from there. Please, Ryan, I know you guys are trying to have a really great gap here, but could you just pop in and say hello to Cameron Mackenzie for me? He said, yeah, I'd love to. So he and his mate went to Le Peuplier Cemetery, and it was in the days before mobile phones. So I didn't hear back from him, whereas today we'd be FaceTiming, we'd be showing everything. So I waited for about 24 hours, and he rang me back the next day and said, Mum, I found his grave. And I said, oh, Ryan, that is so special. He would be stoked. And he said, what's the date of today? And I think it was the 9th of May.
Yep, it was the 9th of May.
And he said, Mum, that's his anniversary.
Wow.
So I rang Alicia and I said, here's a little bit extra. Ryan's over there. He's found Mackenzie. And when he was at his grave, he was there on the date of his anniversary. And both of us for a moment just breathed and went, there's something in this. And I thanked her, and she said, it wasn't me. She said, they just found me to tell you a message. So we hung up, and then I rang her 3 days later to see how she was. And she said, they stopped appearing.
Yeah, that's when they stopped appearing.
They stopped appearing.
So they'd given the message, but the box had been opened.
And somebody, we could have stopped there. Somebody from the family had gone to see one of them, and we could have stopped there, and that might have been the end of it. And I told Mum, and Mum didn't know these boys, so it didn't make a lot of sense to her. But to me, I felt a connection and finally a reason to go to Anzac Day and to be really a true part of it. But it doesn't stop there, because as you will find out throughout this podcast, things happen to us and we grab them, and then after a while we go, oh, okay, we've acknowledged it, we've figured that out, that's great, that's fine, let's put it away, and something else happens. So it wasn't the end of the story. So Ryan had found his grave. He didn't go to Belgium, but it made us want to go over there.
So it was just a little bit further on that Ryan was working for Qantas, and we had the opportunity to go on a trip with him on one of his trips there, and we drove up to both sites, didn't we?
We hadn't seen Hurahan site before,
No.
and we knew nothing about the Menengate and the amazing ceremonies they give nightly to the names of all of the boys on the wall. It opened up a whole different gamut of possibilities, and it was because 2 boys had been at the end of the bed.
But it's quite amazing, though, when we were standing there with Ryan and Isabel at the graves, particularly Mackenzie's grave, knowing that we were the first relatives that had ever been there. This young boy from North Queensland had gone over there, fought, had been killed, and all of a sudden, here were relatives 100 years later standing in front of his grave.
I did ask Mum if I could take something from her family to put in his grave, and she gave me some Australian coins and a little prayer that I dug down into his grave. But Le Peuplier is one of those beautiful little cemeteries, so well looked after by our French friends. There are, I think, around 100 boys buried there, and most of them are Scottish. Now, Mum's a Scot, Mackenzie's a Scot, and he was also a dairy farmer. So one time when we visited his grave, what should come over to the fences as we're looking at his grave but these beautiful dairy cows. So these synchronistic little messages and images and symbols you get when you're on the right track happen. Whether or not you acknowledge them means that you've taken 100% of the experience or 2%. We were in 150% because all of a sudden things were making sense. And we started running tours there. We decided that if we got such a buzz out of discovering something that we never knew existed, other people would. And remember, this is before the centenary of the Somme, so this is 2011. So we thought in our school holidays, we will take people to the Somme.
So, yeah, we came home, and after you told the story to many people, they got excited, didn't they? They found all of a sudden they had relatives and they had never seen them. And our stories really picked them up, and they wanted to be involved and to find out. So that's where our tours started. We'd been travelling.
And look, we're not military by any means.
No.
I am not aware of any of the procedures or the battles. I am now aware of the battles only through research, not from first-hand experience. Michael's family is German.
Interestingly enough, you might say that, Donna, because when we went over there with Ryan to find Hurahan Mackenzie, I, not to be outdone, was sure that there had been a German somewhere along the line, and due to the German records that we were able to get into, we found out that yes, there was. There was one from Württemberg, which was the same area where our family came from, and we set off. And on one of the times we were there, we went and found a Michael Fechner, a German on the other side, not far from where the Hurahan and Mackenzie stories have been told.
That afternoon was a bit
It was?
It was a bit spooky. The kids and I, we were driving through, and all you could hear were gunshots because there were lots of hides. It was a hunting area, and it was late in the afternoon, perfect time to be hunting. So we ended up at this graveyard.
Massemy. Outside of Albert, a little bit further north.
You will understand that Michael's handling of foreign languages is really quite bad. Maybe he should be drinking a glass of wine instead of me. But when we got there, the sun was setting, and the uncanny noises of, guns being shot in the background was quite strange. And we went through the German cemeteries are at the bottom of the hills.
Oh, they're quite,
grey.
yes.
The headstones are grey. They're very sad. They're very sad.
Commonwealth war graves are beautifully cared for. They are white marble, sandstone, headstones.
There's a huge difference.
They're
between
beautiful.
both. And there's a lot of mass graves
Yes.
in the German collection.
The German ones end up at the bottom of hills, and as Donna said, they're dark crosses. And normally there are 2 soldiers buried back to back in each of the graves.
And the presence of trees is really important. So many of our cemeteries don't have trees. The German tradition is to have trees. We've learnt so much about all, and then too, because it was World War One, many Jewish people had fought with the Germans. So the Jewish people have this tradition of putting rocks, like rock castles, rock buildings on the top of their
just a little bit of rock
headstones.
towers.
So each rock they place is a prayer for the departed. So we entered this whole new world, and it was growing dark, and of course the kids were whinging and hungry,
and we were looking for Michael Fechner in a grave of some 15,000 soldiers buried. That's the other incredible thing. In some of these graveyards, mass graves, there's anything up to 15,000 soldiers buried in some of them. Quite amazing.
But anyway, the kids whinging, it's getting dark. We'd gone through like 40 or 50 rows, no Fechner. And then, of course, Michael finds Fechner in this mass grave. We were quite relieved, actually, because it meant that we could go, but he matched the spelling of the name, because the spelling of the name, for those of you who speak German, is
quite unique.
Very important. So we acknowledged him, and as fate would have it, he was like 2 hills away from where Mackenzie was laid. So I'm sure Mr. Fechner and Mackenzie met each other, perhaps.
But we then
Fechner was a truck driver.
He was a lorry driver from Württemberg, and obviously we now have soldiers on both sides, which is quite an interesting turn, because all of a sudden we are really embedded in this story, because it's just incredible.
But it's also a wonderful turn, because that's what war is about, right? That we stuff things up, and that we learn that it was a mess, and that life moves on. So we came home. It was difficult for you to research.
It was. The German website is not as well done. Today it's a little better, but it was difficult. Certainly not as good as the Commonwealth War Graves and the National Archives of Australia, that have got incredible information. And accordingly, also, a lot of the information was destroyed during World War II in some of those places, where in Australia we didn't have that opportunity for it to happen here. But look, Donna, we came home after all that.
We came home.
And all of a sudden we had stories. We had these incredible stories. We'd go to people and we'd tell them the stories.
But it wasn't just stories. We had a buzz.
Yeah.
There was a buzz, and I felt really proud. And, no offence to Mum, and I totally understand how difficult it was when the boys first came home from World War One, but I could carry that flag, and I was giving that to my children.
And every Anzac Day then, we could actually tell real stories about real people. Yeah. We actually had the stories about real people that made other people be part of it. And as we got back and started talking to other people, friends came around, and all of a sudden we had 10, 15, 20 people that had relatives that they knew nothing about, and they asked us, would you help us find them?
So what we would do would research first, and then we would take them on a tour of the Somme.
We would
go back to the battlefield or the trench area where their grandfather, great-grandfather had been killed, and let them stand in that spot where they had passed.
Sometimes the first family member that had been back to that site since the Great War. So it was we'd been running tours to Japan, and this was a natural thing. We knew nothing about the Western Front, but all of a sudden it became a really big part of our lives. So we had groups of 10, 15, 20 people that we'd travel across there, as Donna said, and we'd take them around the battlefields. And, on a number of occasions we found people that, as Donna said, we could walk them right into a trench line and show them.
There was one lady near Pozières, I think it was Murder Line Trench near Pozières. Her great-grandfather had been killed there, and his body never returned to Australia. And she was totally emotional. And if people came back on the bus after a day with us without crying, we hadn't done our job. So we usually stood there, offered a little prayer. And this fabulous woman, being quite emotional, we were helping her back to the bus, and she nearly got hit by a car as she was crossing the road. So, there are, and we had a laugh about that, and she was saying, that's my great-granddad, he's telling me, be careful. So, that sense of humour that we as Australians have as well, that acknowledgement and celebration of our boys or our ancestors, but then that, you know what, to be an Australian is really important, whether it be in France or wherever. And you will find in this podcast, that's another theme that carries through. We're so proud to be Australian. We're so proud of what our boys did in that time because the story still lives on in 2024.
And it's interesting because from a French perspective in particular and a German perspective, as we know, Europe has been engaged in war for so long. In Europe, wars have come and gone. France have been run through from Middle Ages right up until before the Great War. So the French people in particular found it a little bit crazy why all these Australians were constantly interested in their family history when it was part of French history very much so every day. Whereas for us, again, going back to the early 1900s, Australia was a newly developed country and these people enlisted and went to a war in a far-off country that was an adventure, was a bit of excitement.
So through our research, it's twofold. Firstly, it was an adventure for many of them, and they didn't think it would take very long. They thought they would get a trip overseas. Secondly, as Australians, we have never been invaded. So freedom and the right to own your own country is important. So we want to fight for other people whose country is being covered by another set of people who shouldn't be there. So we wanted to protect them. We wanted to protect the right to be your own person in your own country. So you know what, from knowing nothing to the end of that first year, it was huge.
And it became obvious that this was going to be part of our journey. So every holiday time we'd be engaged in some way. We'd always be there on Anzac Day. And amazingly, again, the box opens a little bit further and something pops out, because one night on TV after we'd been home, we heard about this story of a small village in France that Australian soldiers and others had gone through during the war, and photos had been taken. And here on Channel 7 on Sunday night, there was a program that talked about the lost diggers of Vignacourt. And there was this story that we were to again have unfold in front of us about Australian soldiers coming through and back from the village during the war and after their time in the trenches. So it was a
behind-the-lines village that the boys would go to after facing the front lines to be bathed, new uniforms, haircut, get rid of the lice, relax, breathe.
And get ready for the next onslaught.
Get ready for the next one.
And there was a lovely couple there by the name of Louis and Antoinette Tulier. And Louis had been a French soldier at Verdun, where there was incredible loss of French soldiers.
And he was suffering major PTSD.
So he came home and he opened up a workshop, a motorbike workshop, and did other things in the village.
He was a bit of an entrepreneur, Louis. He was always had his finger in every pie. And Antoinette was his stabling force. And she was the woman behind the man. And so in the next couple of podcasts, you'll hear their story.
You'll learn their story.
And how important they were to us. Because in their collection, there were 4,000 photographs. Yes?
Yeah, over
800 were Australian. And at the time when we entered the picture, about 110 had been identified.
It's an incredible backstory because a historian by the name of Laurent Marouz had found some evidence of these photos in the late 1990s, and nobody really wanted to know anything about them until a news report appeared in a British magazine, and all of a sudden Australian people got involved. And to the credit of the businessman Kerry Stokes, who is a great historian and keeper of Australian history, particularly military history, he said to his group of people on Channel 7 and the reporters, go and find these glass plates. And so the story of discovering them is an incredible story on its own. But Laurent Marouz was instrumental in finding the glass plates along with Ross Coulthard from Channel 7 and Max Utrecht. And all of a sudden we had this collection of glass plates that was being shown up on the TV. And I said to Donna at the time, I said, when we go next April, we must find this village out.
So this is, and we'll use the word synchronicity. Here's a synchronistic point. We were finished, we'll just do tours, and now these photographs have appeared in the area that we were visiting. So it led us to the discovery of the village of Vignacourt, the discovery of the Tulier collection, the discovery and the writing of the book by Ross Coulthart called The Lost Diggers, the fact that these glass plates had been found and were just about to be destroyed before Kerry Stokes offered to take them and give them to the Australian War Memorial.
The village house, the barn of the Tuliers, obviously Louis and Antoinette had passed on, but the house was going to be bulldozed and demolished.
Yeah.
And we know that in other French villages, there may have been other photographers. The Tuliers
Lots of glass plates.
They weren't on their own in taking the photographs, but the thing that stood out about the Tuliers was that Louis kept every single glass plate. Other photographers would wash the emulsion off, take new glass plates and print postcards or whatever. Louis kept every single one in the barn, and it was those photographic plates that were discovered.
And in actual fact, they got to a point where Antoinette would find that some of the glass was missing out of her windows because during the war, of course, as you would expect towards the end, 1917, 18, things were getting pretty tight. He would use the glass out of the windows to project the images of the photos onto, so they were freezing in their house in some places, because he was determined to present these photos, put them on postcards, give them to soldiers, so the soldiers could send them home to their parents, and they would pay a meagre fee to Louis and Antoinette. So Louis and Antoinette had a little business running, and it was many of the boys dying at Fromelles, Pozières, the local areas, had a Tulier photo in their pocket when they passed. So it was...
Many of the photos didn't get home, and in actual fact today, there are very few of the original Tulier postcards in existence because a lot of them went off with soldiers who were to die and not get them home. But the collection is truly incredible, and you know the discovery of them. The story goes that a wonderful lady by the name of Madame Crognier pulled out a little box and brought them out to the Channel 7 team and said, "Oh, here are some photos." They looked at them and said, "Oh, yeah, they're incredible." Certainly, Laurent Marouz was incredibly impressed because a lot of these photographs had been printed sometime before in the 80s and had appeared around the roof in the Marie or the mayor's office. And all of a sudden, he was very excited. And Madame Crognier said, "Well, here are some, but I know where there are more." And of course, then we know that they were found in the Tulier house, and the rest is history.
I think the special thing about them is that they're not formal.
No.
They're quite relaxed. They might have a bottle of wine, a glass of wine like I have in my hand at the moment. They might be sitting with a French girl. They might be sitting with a duck or a dog, because Antoinette was very good, from what we can gather, about relaxing these boys. They had seen horrific things on the battlefields, and many of them had that 100-yard stare that we all know appear in a lot of the formal photographs of soldiers after battles. Antoinette would relax them. Louis would take the photo, and hence we have this amazing collection called the Tulier Collection, which Kerry Stokes has donated to the Australian War Memorial. And it has travelled in the past. I don't know if it will travel again, but we have it in our very hands.
And Ross Coulthart did a beautiful book
Amazing.
that tells the stories.
He and his wife researched a lot.
And the stories are just beautiful. He's done one for the Lost Diggers because there's also Tommies and other nationalities in the collection. But if you get a chance to get a hold of The Lost Diggers of Vignacourt by Ross Coulthart, you will enjoy and just be mesmerised.
Just look at the images and know that there's no identification on their sleeves.
Yeah, nothing.
So that's what the difficulty has been. So going into the war diaries, retracing, which is what we have done and assisted in some soldiers' stories, to allow other families to celebrate ancestors like we managed to do through a dream. If we can help other families do that, then we're honoured.
So we went to that village the first time out. We went to the next tour with a group of 15 people, and that story is going to be the next episode.
Of what happens next.
So watch out, because we continue to take a chance.
And you know what? My glass is finished now, so I'm going to pop a bottle next time we meet. Au revoir.